Welcome to Dire Straits. I'm Amanda Monty.
I'm Tracy Clark-Flory.
Today we're asking an age-old question that somehow also feels very of the moment. Can married and unmarried women be friends? More specifically, can married and divorced women be friends? What about married women and women who have no interest in marriage at all, like those who see marriage as a hetero-patriarchal institution we might all do well to opt out of?
We've noticed a certain tension between such groups of women bubbling under the surface of many conversations about the state of feminism, the shifting sands of marriage and heterosexuality, and the dating scene today. In an era where many women are asking if it's embarrassing to have a boyfriend or a husband, or even if it's worth dating men at all, we're diving straight into the question of how all of this is affecting relationships between women themselves.
What goes unspoken between straight women, and how do these silences keep us all trapped and resenting each other rather than the institutions that don't have our best interests at heart? How do our individual choices reflect our politics, and how much pressure do we put on ourselves and each other to solve big political and cultural problems in the absence of a strong feminist movement?
And how do tensions between straight women today reflect a very intentional attempt to divide us, even contributing to our inability to build a cohesive feminist movement? Before we dive in, know that this is a paywalled episode, which means it's the show we put out every month that gets very, very personal. We're going deep on our own friendship, including what it's like for a happily married woman and a happily divorcing woman to build a business together. And we're getting real about the conflicts we've faced with other women as both a married person, that's me, and a woman removing herself from marriage, that's Amanda. To listen to the full episode, upgrade to a paid subscription at direstraitspod.com. That's Straits with a GH. You'll get access to other paywalled episodes, live conversations with us and cool guests, and lots more.
Okay, so first off, let's talk about what's going on in the discourse. Dating and marriage are under scrutiny. Straight women in the U.S. are certainly questioning the idea that a man should be the goal and the focus of their lives, and they are connecting the dots between their intimate lives and U.S. politics. Since the presidential election, we've seen lots of takes on how hetero-pessimist women are, and I've written about how that has really become a way to dismiss women's complaints about men and heterosexuality in general.
Yes, yeah. And we've also seen calls to make marriage lame again. Vogue recently asked if having a boyfriend is embarrassing. And we've seen tons of coverage of the hard data that shows that heterosexual marriage today is plagued by inequality.
Add to all of that the conservative movement's clear obsession with marriage, specifically traditional marriage, and their emphasis on naturalizing gender roles that, of course, keep women subordinate to men. Also, the rollback of women's reproductive rights and a whole influencer class of men and women trying to make objectified white feminine sexuality and hard warrior masculinity great again. There's a lot of reasons for anyone to feel uncomfortable about marriage and heterosexual relationships today.
Yeah. And to be clear, that hard data that I mentioned earlier, it reflects some of the very real reasons that a lot of women are opting out of dating and marriage today. As we've discussed in the past, studies show married women do the most housework of all women. So what are these husbands doing?
Really, what are they doing? I really would like to know. Even so, almost half of women in the U.S. are married. And as attitudes toward marriage shift, women who are already married may feel like all these culture shifts are sort of a direct attack on their way of life or their happiness or even, just their own individual relationships, which they may be, I'm told, finding a lot of value in.
That's especially true because, as I've written, we tend to want to see our own relationship as exceptional, which I think can prevent us from seeing that when we think more structurally and systemically, marriage is just not a good deal for women on the whole. Some women might also be struggling in their marriages, but trying to hold their relationship together for whatever reason, which is bound to make them feel even more implicated, I think, by these big cultural and political conversations.
For sure. And I think we've said this in several episodes, but it's definitely worth repeating, especially for any of our listeners who are married, really happily or not. You know, we know that women stay in unhappy, unequal, exploitative, even abusive marriages for a lot of reasons. You know, there are economic pressures, social pressures, the many coercions of gender and heteronormativity. There may be pressures from family and friends or religious institutions and communities, and we're going to dig into some of that today.
Yes. And there can be a lot of gaslighting and manipulation that happens even in the most basic miserable marriage. Men in public and in private are constantly trying to make women feel like they are asking for too much. Their standards are too high, or they use any number of rationalizations for their own behavior. And when that is wedded to a culture that already tells women to doubt themselves, to blame themselves for their own mistreatment, also that marriage is essential to a happy life, it can be very hard to know when or how to leave.
Yeah, I mean, we've also talked on the show about how women are blamed for their unequal partnerships and for their own divorces, right? Whether it's women, chose the wrong guy, or women didn't listen to or see the red flags. As we discussed in our episode on, red flags, women are always being blamed for men's bad behavior.
Yes, which can then be another deterrent from divorce because women think that it will reflect badly on them. In response to the recent divorce memoir boom, a lot of critics attacked those books on that very basis, arguing that those writers were just, bitter women who picked the wrong guy. And even in response to that viral Vogue article, which asked whether having a boyfriend is embarrassing these days, a lot of people responded by claiming that young women are just afraid of being cringe or of real connection, and that must be why the dating scene is so bad.
Meanwhile, women are creating entire online communities to protect themselves from what they're seeing out there in the dating pool.
Yeah, right.
I wrote a little bit about that Vogue article and asked whether marriage has become embarrassing today. And one point I really wanted to make is that rejecting marriage is not a rejection of love or even earnestness. Or connection, right? It isn't a rejection of loving and caring relationships. It's not even necessarily a rejection of long-term monogamy. It can be, or even a rejection of relationships with men, which is maybe a little different from the boyfriend discourse. But the rejection of marriage, as a social, economic, and political institution, many feminists have argued, is a way of thinking a little bit bigger about real love and connection. Like, there's so many ways to have love in one's life, to have a family, and even to have a romantic or sexual partner.
Right. Yeah. And it could actually be a way of more fully and even earnestly embracing love in your life. But I'm sure we will get to all of that.
Yes, for sure. But in general, whether we're talking about the heteropessimism discourse or conversations about, women's shifting attitudes toward dating and marriage, things can get pretty victim blamey pretty fast. And all of these factors create, more than like stigma against divorce, right? They create this entire cultural and financial system that works against women, or really anyone, right, living independent, single lives. And it can keep a lot of women feeling trapped in marriage.
Yes. Yeah. At the same time, I think we also have to talk about marriage as something that we can opt out of and encourage each other to find agency in our lives and to question how we might be complicit in our own oppression or even just emotionally attached to ways of life and fantasies that exploit and oppress all of us. So for married women, it can be kind of challenging to hold these two realities at the same time. And I would say that that's where a lot of tension between married and single women seems to arise.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about sort of holding the big cultural, structural, systemic critique against, our individual selves, our choices, our relationships. So we're talking here about, all of the sort of complications that married women might be feeling given the bigger cultural landscape and the political discourse. Tracy, I want to ask you are married.
I am.
Are you embarrassed about it?
Yeah. Yeah, I am. I mean, I think I might be a little outside the norm in that I am very inclined to critique hetero marriage,
Clearly,
as evidenced by this podcast that I just started to start with you. And I actually remember you reading an early draft of my upcoming memoir, which is called My Mother's Daughter, and everyone should definitely go buy it right now.
Yes,
Pre-orders are so important.
So good.
Amanda's read it. There's a blurb from her on the cover. And when you were reading that draft, that early draft, I remember you making a comment. And it made me laugh. And it's stuck with me ever since. You said, it feels like you think you're a bad feminist for being married. Or I think you might have said, it sometimes feels like you think you're a bad feminist for being married. And yeah, there is some of that feeling, even though that's not what I actually believe. I do have a little bit of that feeling. I feel inherently conflicted about that, right? And that is something that's tough for me to, I don't know, even really feel resolved about.
Well, I feel like we should unpack that because my sense is that a lot of married women today, right now, either feel that or they fear that. And it seems to be sort of bubbling up under a lot of online discourse and cultural conversations, which is why we wanted to do this episode. After the recent Taylor Swift album came out, I even saw, some liberal women arguing, something to the effect of we can't let the right or conservatives have marriage and motherhood and family. And I was kind of like, well, actually, as they stand.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of dig into that. Why do you think that you feel that way?
I think that my struggle really is with feeling that I have found a happy partnership, one that actually feels like a true partnership, but that we've built this life within systems that I ideologically oppose, which would be marriage, the nuclear family. My memoir, the one that you were reading and giving me feedback on, is very much about how these systems have been designed to oppress women, and also about how my mom's story fits into that. The long story short of it is that 20 years before I was born, she was sent away in shame as a pregnant teenager in the 60s to a home for unwed mothers, as they called them back then, where she placed her baby, my half-sister, for adoption under very coercive circumstances. And these homes were specifically designed to turn quote-unquote bad girls, like my mom, who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, into proper women and wives and mothers, because the only way to be a proper mother was to be married, right? And so these homes literally existed to try to help contain women's sexuality within the white nuclear family home. So here I am, decades later, finding happiness within this institution that had so much to do with this like fracture in my family, and all of my mom's trauma from that event, and so I feel, of course, like incredibly conflicted, finding some of my greatest joys, my greatest sense of intimacy and pleasure within that institution designed for oppression and inequality and exploitation.
Mm-hmm. But then so much of what you do in your daily life is unpack those institutions and, try to think bigger than the nuclear family. Even in your book, like you write about like thinking beyond, the way that we tend to think about family. But I wonder if we could like slow down a little bit, because I know that you and I often talk about these things as like, nuclear family, not great,
Mm-hmm.
marriage, like all these problems are baked in to it. Like, I wonder if we should explain for listeners a little bit why we think these cultural ideas about marriage and the family impacted your mom's story and continue
Mm-hmm.
to, to put it lightly, create problems for women.
Yes. I mean, the control of women's sexuality, the
Mm-hmm.
division of women into categories of good and bad, and specifically good women essentially being women who are owned by a man, a lone man, and, women who are bad being free, essentially, not being owned by a man.
Even today, when we think of marriage in, maybe more progressive ways, right? You might not feel like you're owned by your husband, but there is a kind of capturing of sexuality anyway, which we talked about in our Fifth Shift episode.
Yes, and which we'll talk about, oh my gosh, in our upcoming episode on monogamy, like we will, I am sure, get into this concept of compulsory monogamy, right? Like the way that when you step into married life and married parental life, especially, the way that you can then be pulled into things like monogamy, these expectations of what it means to be married, to be a wife, to be a family, that are much bigger than just, of course, your relationship with this person that you've, committed your life to.
Because not only are you like sexually supposed to be like exclusive with your partner, right?
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, your whole life is supposed to be built around this one partner.
Yes. Well, yeah. And I'm always going on about the like friendships between men and women and the way that it is then taboo for women within those contexts to interact with other men, to develop meaningful connections and relationships with other men because of it's, seen as a threat to the monogamous nuclear family. And so there is this real isolating effect, right? And that reinforces these ideas about gender and divisions between men and women, but then also, of course, there's just the fact that the nuclear family prioritizes the family above all and can be so very individualistic. It's not about community and the collective. It's in many ways pretty antisocial, and so like all of that stands completely in opposition to, how I think of my values and my politics, right? But it's very hard to step out of that because it's how our worlds are arranged.
Right. Yes. I wrote a little bit about the sort of antisocial nature of trad discourse, which I think is exactly in line with what you're saying, right? That while on the surface, these ideas of family look like, connection and care, right? They're actually about optimizing your children, optimizing your real estate, optimizing your generational wealth, optimizing each other as individuals, right? And keeping that all within, your sort of like heterosexual relationship and your 1.5 kids.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it puts all the pressure on women to do the work of that, you know, is lacking because of our lack of a social safety net, you know.
Exactly.
I mean, it is a kind of brilliant system of exploitation, really, you know. It's
completely. And it really does rely on the marriage contract, you know. So one thing that I think about a lot is like we're talking about these features of the nuclear family, you know, how marriage you know, affects sexuality, right? But also like having a great love or partnership, being even great co-parents or cohabitating, these are not actually things that require a marriage contract and all of the sort of financial advantages that we give to married people in this country, right?
Yeah.
So they're not things that actually require you to combine your assets, right? And then divide them if you get divorced in contentious legal proceedings for many, right?
Yeah.
You know, being in love and having a long-term partnership is not inseparable from, again, getting tax benefits that single people don't get, or ceding your financial independence, which I know many women sort of do when they enter marriage, only to realize later that they have done that and sort of what the effects of that might be for them if they ever do want to leave their marriage.
Right.
You know, and again, all of that is before even getting into the rampant inequality that is baked into most heterosexual marriages, as you know, feminists have been saying forever, but, you know, study after study also proves, you know, if you need a study, they're there. And it's before even getting into questions about whether husbands, you know, should be the center of women's lives. So not just the family becomes the center of a woman's life, right? But a man, right? And we're hearing a lot of pushback in the decentering men discourse. You know, like I have several close friends and family members who are not married. Some have kids together, some don't, and they have no plans to marry, but they're very committed to each other.
I mean, Christopher and I have asked each other at moments, like, why did we get married again? And every time we ask that question, it's never been from a place of like, we don't want to be together. It's more isn't it weird, again, that we found ourselves in this institution that we both are ideologically opposed to on so many levels? And, you know, the best answers for like why we chose this path, as opposed to cohabitating, having a kid without being married, is like, tax benefits. Oh, well, you know, visiting each other in the hospital, I guess. You know, it's like all these like ideas about like the sort of benefits of, or like what if something happens to you, or what if, you know, these you know, it's the state benefits, it's the disaster planning, of course, but obviously, like, you know, you are pointing towards like there are a lot of downsides to choosing that, because when you if a couple does decide to part ways, there's so many very practical disincentives and economic punishments, like, you know, costs for having to disentangle everything, right? So, but that's not like we're sold the picture of marriage as a pure benefit.
Right. And I mean, I think we are probably due for an episode at some point about like women and money and financial independence, and because that, I know that's something that I never really thought about when I got married, because I was marrying a good man, you know, and it was like, we're gonna pool everything and we're gonna be married and we're gonna get the benefits, and you know, of course, you know, why wouldn't we do that? So that's one element of it. But you know, I also, I'm curious to hear what you think of like how your views on marriage have changed since you did decide to get married. Because I know that I got married before I could really see all the things that we're discussing now, you know, even as like a learned feminist, you know, I still didn't quite get it. And I know I did that looking back because of like the social capital of being married and having a wedding, for sure. But also because I thought it made my life and me complete. Like I really was invested in the real romance and the dream of it all, and having a family that was intact, because, you know, my parents were divorced when I was young. And so there was a lot of that sort of, aspirational fantasy stuff, even probably middle-class striving baked into it, and I think a lot of married women get older and they realize what the institution of marriage really is, and some of them want out, like full stop. And some of them, like you, are like, wow, this system is so bad, but I do still love my husband. And so sometimes I think like, well, if I'm getting really empathetic, which we should all do, right? Like, well, what should those women do? I personally don't think that the answer is to like double down and make marriage liberal or bipartisan or something like that, because it's a system that still deprivileges anyone who is not married, an economic system.
Right.
I'm just curious, like, how have your views about marriage changed since you got married? Are these things that you think about? You've hit the paywall, but there's a lot more left in this episode. We discuss the struggles divorced and divorcing women face. Tracy talks about what she struggled with after Amanda shared she was divorcing. Amanda describes the undercurrent of blame that she experienced when she began sharing about her divorce. We talk about how we often hold each other to impossible standards when it comes to the choices of our lives in the absence of a strong feminist movement. And of course, we dig into ways we can all be better friends to each other. To listen to the rest of the episode, you can upgrade your subscription at direstraitspod.com. That's straights with a GH. You will get full access to this episode and all of our paywalled episodes. You also will get instant access to our awesome Substack community, including chats, live events with cool guests. And you'll get the comfort of knowing that you are supporting feminist media in a time when it is under direct threat.